in reality, they are pocket parks. They are pocket parks, public entity. They're a government tool. And the terminology is just very different from what we would usually understand as pocket parks, right? And I think that is what has sort of sparked our common research interest. Say, okay, we're splitting out areas. What is that, right? And how is it actually defined? And how is it defined in the local public open space network? And in a way, we figured out it is not that very clearly defined, right? It is defined as a passive open space, just the smaller scale urban parks. But from there on, it is very opaque. So that actually our research started with this question.
I think there's a few other things that got us interested. One was that there's a lot of these parks, that these are kind of everywhere. And we started talking to each other early on in this project. We started creating stories about the strange park on the corner or the strange park under the bridge. And they all had this theme of either their rest garden or a sitting out area. And we started to think about a way to understand these as a collective asset within the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the terminology is also interesting because I think three of us were trying to figure out what is the official definition of the sitting out areas, and actually asked different people who actually stay in Hong Kong longer than us. So it was an interesting time when we started this project. It was a year when the Oxford English Dictionary actually have the sitting out areas as official entry in 2016. So according to the dictionary, the term itself is actually Hong Kong English. So we can actually trace it back all the way to the late 19th century. This concept got its roots in Hong Kong, and then of course it got a different forms and different procedure of development. So I think that was a very interesting time. Like when we started this project, it was actually the time when the term itself entered the official dictionary of OED.
They exist also, as Lou mentioned, as something that's come from the colonial period, that existed sort of with the beginning of the city and beginning of planning in the city. And I think that's one difference from when we start talking and elaborating on the difference between these small parks, pocket parks, and international examples of pocket parks, is that these are part of the planning extent of open space in Hong Kong. And they are, they're planned in every single neighborhood. They're planned within every residential area. So they're very extensive. Unlike some parks, which are much more of an amenity within a certain area, but not in others.
One of our critiques is that there are no real design guidelines in place for that, right? So as mentioned before, they fall under that network of passive open spaces. And there are few guidelines really, right? The guideline mostly is to actually provide space as such. And in here, that might sound shocking in the European context, but here the public open space provision in an urban neighborhood is 2 square meter per person. That in comparison with the European context. Mm-hmm. And that is very often not even met in Hong Kong, very urbanized areas, right? But besides of that, that necessity to provide these 2 square meters, there are very few guidelines. There are recommendations, but they don't have to be really used all of the time. So for instance, one of the recommendations is to use 70% of softscaping. Now, that gets very difficult in these areas, which are often very leftover spaces, right? They are on slopes, so they have drainage outlets, there is like pipes, there is infrastructure, right? So that gets very compromised, and this 70% of soft landscaping is barely ever met.
Yeah, it's a target, but it's not meaningfully kind of built on as a kind of planning goal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe one part of your question where you asked I think that these are not really, they are planned and they're a government tool, but their implementation is rather ad hoc. I don't see evidence of them being used as within kind of larger scale planning of all of Hong Kong. The sitting out areas come out of very ad hoc decisions within space. So if there's a leftover space next to a development, or if there's a building that gets taken out and they don't want to redevelop the ground where it stood. We can talk more about these sort of different categories later, but they occur in a very ad hoc manner, and they come and go. And so we might see some spaces be removed and others enter into the sort of catalog of open space in Hong Kong.
I think the existing government plans, they don't really think about sitting out areas as valuable systems. But I think, as Susie and Alan mentioned earlier, the size of the sitting out areas actually contribute. For example, 2 square meters per person, public space use. But I think there is a lack of specificities of the site thinking, as well as the relationship between the site and the adjacent neighborhood, as well as the site contribution within a much larger, for example, ecological, cultural, or social network. So I think that is also the reason why we're trying to look at sitting out areas not only as artifacts, but also as part of a larger system that has been overlooked as opportunities for the government to really think about them as armatures, as a landscape use that contribute to, for example, ecosystem services, as well as the social benefits for the communities within the larger context.
We see them as being fairly well used. Again, because they are small, they can fill up very quickly with just a few people. So if in Hong Kong, if you have a place to sit, this is a big amenity within the urban public realm. And so, we do see them being used passively by people. And because they're tend to be located in distributed throughout the city, they're usually one of the first points of access that people have to engage with the open space network in Hong Kong. I think the benefits are a little bit harder to describe. Part of our sort of drawing of these case studies is in a way critiquing the quality of them, is critiquing the amenities available, is kind of showing what exactly these provide, and a lot of them are quite there. And so I think when it comes to describing the amenities, it becomes less clear what people really get from these particular public spaces versus another imagined public space that could exist, that could be maybe more dense with planting or more ecologically productive. From an ecological standpoint, I think we've, anything contributes, any green will contribute something. But I think because they're so small, they don't contribute a lot. And so they don't have great ecological services, but when you add them up with the street trees, with the other green areas in the city, they do help tie things together.
What you basically perceive as being a transitional area comes also from that they vary a lot in size, right? So the smallest one we found is 50 square meters. So that's basically, a larger living room. And the biggest one we mapped out is 7,000 square meters. But roughly they are all sort of under half a hectare, right? Which means, okay, if you have like a tree and a bench in 50 square meters, then, it's just a better bus stop, right? In that understanding. But for sure, if, in these very dense neighborhoods, they actually do get used a lot, and there are people really, like, the access is already part of the space.
So I think there's a couple things I think we can talk about when we refer to a conclusion or the kind of aim of the book. I think a major one that we refer to over and over again in the book is the need for the government to address these as a network, as a system. We referred to this already, but because there are so many, because they're so widely spread out, there's a really great potential for them to act more in more ecological ways, to filter more water, to be more about the particular communities they're in, rather than being sort of filled with unthinking design elements that occur anywhere else. So we think, and this comes back to also connecting to pocket parks and small urban open space around the world today, which is increasingly being positioned as a really critical resource. As we're understanding nature in the city differently, and as we're understanding the value of public space and diversities of public space better in our urban centers, it really puts a kind of pressure on these spaces to become more diverse, to become more engaged with their communities, to become more linked, to offer more services. So I think that's one big takeaway we want to have with this book, is that the government should do more. It's their space. It belongs to the people in another way. There's so much potential and it just isn't being met.